While I was rewatching season 2 to make the recap, I came across several moments that I absolutely loved that really delighted me, and I remembered how much I enjoyed them when season 2 was actually premiering on TV. This season saw a lot of deviations from the book, but I actually thought that they were some of the strongest points of the show so far and wanted to give them the shout out that I thought they really deserved. So in order from least impressive to most impressive, here are my 5 best moments of season 2. Number 5 is when Angelica and Paola ask Mary Malone and Cittàgazze if she can stay with them. She ends up running into these 2 girls in Cittàgazze when she gets there, and they are alone. They recognize that she is an adult and she could potentially give them the things that they miss. I found this really touching. We see how aggressive and scared Angelica and Paola are when they encounter Lyra and Will earlier, but this is really a moment when we see them for who they are, and that's kids without parents. This really struck me as kind of an interesting contrast to Will and Lyra, who are also without parents in a way, but who seem to be doing pretty well. They have such a different relationship with the adults in their lives than Angelica and Paola, and it made me think about the idea of the parentified child. The story is really about kids who are mature beyond their years, having to do really, really hard things that kids shouldn't have to do by themselves, but who are in various ways kicking ass, like doing all the things without a ton of help or resources. Just thought this was a really interesting contrast, and of course Mary can't stay with them, but she does offer to escort them to their adults in the mountains, so that was pretty heartwarming to see. My number 4 spot goes to a scene in episode 7 when Mrs. Coulter and the Golden Monkey Demon are hanging out in the Tower of the Angels, and Mrs. Coulter kicks the Golden Monkey. That in itself wasn't shocking knowing her, but it did make me cringe, and it really made me think about her relationship with her demon. We see over the course of this season how complicated it is. There are a few points when she physically leaves the Golden Monkey, and it becomes again very obvious that she and the Golden Monkey are separated in a way that most humans are not. I also noticed that the Golden Monkey does not speak English. He grunts. He sounds like a monkey, not like a person in a monkey's body, which is in stark contrast to the other demons that we observe. I am kind of interpreting this to think that maybe he's not evolving in the same way that Mrs. Coulter has as an adult growing up. Maybe there's something about him that got stuck or is different. He seems to be all about immediate gratification. He is almost childlike. He is the one who wants physical comfort. He's the one who wants to take revenge. He's kind of her henchman in that he does the dirty work. I really think that he might represent baby Marissa, and she wants nothing to do with him, which is fascinating. Spot number 3 goes to Mrs. Coulter losing her shit on Lord Boreal. This is after she meets Mary Malone, comes back to Lord Boreal's house, and blows up at him about how absolutely shitty the patriarchy is. I adored this moment. I actually found it pretty funny, but also like so empathy building towards Mrs. Coulter. We find out just how much she's compromised in her personal history when it comes to her position in the world, her intelligence, her capabilities. We find out that she was an honorary scholar but couldn't actually become a full-fledged scholar because she's a woman. We find out that all of her efforts are eventually kind of claimed by men. She does all the work, they do all the credit, and frankly she's sick of it. And we see her realizing how much her life could be different if she were born in a different world, like the world she's in now, Will's world, ostensibly our world that we live in. It's kind of tragic to see all of her wasted potential. So loved this scene, thought it was great in the empathy department, and I think kind of rounds out our understanding of of what drives her and also why she is so fucking resentful all the time. Spot number 2 goes to Lyra eating Will's omelet with her bare fucking hands. Laughed so hard when I saw this scene. I was so glad that they brought this scene from the book. I just love this detail about Lyra, and it really reminded me of all of the things that I love about book Lyra. She is a coarse and greedy little savage in the book. This is OG Lyra at her very best. And my very favorite, very best scene from season 2 is definitely the conversation between Lee Scoresby and Mrs. Coulter. Again, this is a big deviation from the book. The two never have this conversation in The Subtle Knife, but I thought this was a genius addition to the show and really brought a depth to both characters, to be honest. I've said many times now that Lin-Manuel Miranda was not at all a choice I agreed with for Lee Scoresby, but I almost felt like this scene was a redeeming factor for him. I also loved how it gave us insight into Mrs. Coulter that we certainly don't get in the book in this way, or at least we haven't yet. We might in the third book, in the Book of Dust. Here's hoping, crossing my fingers. But in the scene, we find out that Lee Scoresby was horrifically physically abused as a kid, and as a result, he is very tolerant of pain physically. Mrs. Coulter hits him, the golden monkey attacks Hester, and we see him very resilient in the face of physical torture. And he tells her that in his childhood, his dad would take out whatever grievance he had against Lee. Lee would eventually apologize for whatever the issue was, and there was a part of Lee that felt grateful for the punishment, that felt like in some way he deserved the punishment. And we can see how affected Mrs. Coulter is by this. Lee is really getting under her skin, and it doesn't take him long to recognize that Mrs. Coulter had a very similar childhood. He can see it in her that she is good with pain, and we know that she's good with pain. She inflicts pain, she has pain happen to her. I just really appreciated the nuance of this conversation. I appreciated that Lee said, you know, that love is not enough. Love and safety are not the same, and a parent can love their child and still be a fucking terrible parent. And that is what Mrs. Coulter has been. This was a really brilliant discussion of how physical abuse can affect kids as they grow up into adults, and that chain of violence continues. And yeah, it just brought a lot of insight into both of these characters and brought a lot of humanity. I especially appreciated that directly after this scene, Mrs. Coulter walks out of the room that Lee is being held in, and she's visibly shaken. She's really upset and probably triggered by this conversation, and she's obviously going back to a previous time. And we see the golden monkey put his paw in her hand, and for once she doesn't kick him, she doesn't hit him, she accepts his hand. And you know, on the other side of the wall, we see Hester and Lee comforting each other, and Hester makes a comment, "It's been a long time since I've heard you talk about him, and you did the right thing." We see these two adults who are just broken children who've grown up to be very different people, though. So those are my top 5 best, weirdest, most interesting moments of season 2. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Were there other moments that you preferred instead, or that you thought were more interesting or more entertaining, I guess? Let me know. Would love to hear your opinion in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you again for the breakdown of season 3, episode 1 next month when it premieres.